Now that we've finished the discussion of the notation of time in music, and we've discussed how time runs along this axis, we can now go on to discuss the notation of pitch. So, music notation has the two axes, the time running along that axis and pitch running along this one. So, in principle, the pitch notation is actually a little bit simpler than time, because it doesn't have all the complications associated with notating time. Basically, all that you do is you have some names running. I'll just start at A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then once we've gotten up to G, we start again. A, B, C, D, E, and so forth. F, G. And then, obviously, we'll carry on. Each time we start a new A, each time we start the name sequence again, we start a new octave. So if we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So the 8th note is the start of the new octave. Okay, so that's the basic principle of note names, and it's really quite straightforward when you look at it that way. Now, because we don't actually write the names of the notes, we need some way to find our way among these names. So for that we use lines. So if I can just restart this over here, just full that up there. So what we're going to do is we're just going to add some lines over here just to give us a guide. So how it works is we'll have one line that goes through, and then the next note will be in a space. The next note will be on a line, and the next in a space. Line, space, line, space, line, space, line, space, line, space, line. So like that. So each one of these would be an individual note. So there we go. Note, 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 and so forth. And so that's the basic principle of how we do the note names. But one can see, for example, here the A is on a line, and here the A is in a space. Now, the reason for this working this way is obviously because you have 7 note names, and divided by 2. So that means that each time you go through the sequence, it won't fit in perfectly, and so each time you'll have a note that was in a space will be in a line the next time. Okay, so this is a little bit confusing. Let's go to real stuff. So when we have staff notation like that, we just have the 5 lines running across, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then, for our purposes now, we can just put it anywhere. So we can say that this one over here is A, B, C, oops, sorry, that's supposed to be C, C, D, E, F, G, and A over there. So what I've gone and done now is I've just picked arbitrarily to start the note at the bottom line with an A. But in practice we don't have quite that much freedom, because otherwise if you could just put any note on in any position, it would be quite difficult to read. So what we have is we have what's called a clef. Now, clef in French just literally means key. And if you have a look, these lines are almost like map coordinates. It's like a map grid. And just like if you have a map, you need to have some sort of key to show you where you are. So for example, on a map you might have the equator marked out, or you'll have north pointed out, or whatever. Some sort of key just to orient yourself. So what we have in music is we have these things. Now this is the G clef, and then you get other clefs as well, like this one, the F clef, and finally you get the C clef. So each of these shows where a particular note is. This one shows you where G is, this one shows you where F is, this one shows you where C is. But just to make life more complicated, this is not just any these are not just any G's or any F's or any C's. So for example, if we put our G clef over here, which would indicate that this note is a G, we couldn't put an F clef here, oops, over there, to show that this note is an F, because this G shows a particular G and that one shows a particular F, and they can't be right next to each other. So let's just have a look at that quickly. Now, the other name for the G clef is treble. And treble is just another name for soprano, which is the high pitch. So I'm just going to put a little arrow up there. And the other name for the F clef is bass, which is the low pitch. In other words, down there. And the C clef can be used for either the tenor or the alto. Now anybody who's sung in a choir will know that the tenor and the alto are the voices that sit in between the treble and the bass. And so that's sort of in the middle. Now that already gives a good guide as to how these things are oriented with respect to each other. So let's get a little bit more specific about this. But the important thing here to remember is that this is the treble clef, the bass clef, the tenor and the alto. Now, just to be clear, sometimes these things can have other names. Like for example, this thing, if we put it in a different position, is sometimes called the French violin clef. And you can sometimes put the bass clef in a different position and call it the baritone clef. So technically, these names, the treble, the bass, and the tenor, alto, refers to the specific position on the staff, whereas these names are the names for the clefs themselves. So, but usually in modern notation, we only use treble, bass, tenor, and alto. We don't use them in other positions anymore. So that simplifies matters a little bit. So now let's just have a look at the relative position. So what's useful to help get an idea is just to draw what's called a grand staff. Now, this is just a staff where you have a whole bunch of lines together. Usually these would be separated out and much further away from each other. But now in this case what we're doing is we're just drawing them all as if they were one big staff. And what you can do is you can imagine there is a line going down the middle here. So you have the whole big conglomeration of lines. Now of course that would be completely impossible to read. So we're just making a little guideline here in the middle, just so you can see where the middle is. So if I've done it correctly, it should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down the bottom. Okay, great. Now the note in the middle here, on that line, is middle C. So middle C will sit over there. And this, coincidentally, is the note that's indicated by the alto and tenor clef. So both the tenor and alto clef point to this note over here, tenor and alto. And this line here in the middle is just that C line. So technically the clef would look like that, but it will always, for our purposes, it will always sit on a line, so like that. And then above that clef, there will be the treble clef over there. And below that will be the bass clef like that. So in other words, we go C, that's where our clef is there, so that's a C. D is over here, E, F, G. And C, B would be over there. If we turn it into notes, it would look like that. A, G, F. So there's a nice symmetry to it. Each time just shows the G closest to the middle C and the F closest to middle C as well. So that's the relative position of it. And so it's just quite important to recognize that it's not just some F, it's that particular F. The name middle C, it's the C that's in the middle of the piano. It has a particular frequency, but we won't worry too much about those sorts of details. So that's the basic idea of the clef. Now, usually you will have the clefs separated out, so you won't have them put together like that. So what you'll have is you'll have a separated out clef, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then you'll either have the treble clef. If it's a treble clef, you can use little rhymes to work out what the what the notes are. So this will be an E, G, B, D, F. You can say every good boy deserves fudge. Or another favorite is to do, for the spaces, you can do F, A, C, E, which spells face. Now, I understand why people want to use rhymes and things like that, and it's perfectly understandable, perfectly reasonable. But my feeling is that if you're using rhymes to remember the note names, you probably don't know them well enough to use them in the first place. So there's only one real way, and that's to practice using them until you know them well enough. So although rhymes can kind of get you into reading them, I wouldn't rely on them to really get around the note names. Okay, so let's just do a similar thing here for the bass clef, and then now there's two ways of approaching the bass clef. The easiest way, if you don't play an instrument that happens to read the bass clef a lot, so say you play an instrument like the flute or the violin that only really uses the treble clef. One little trick way of getting around it is to get really, really comfortable with naming the notes in the treble clef. And then all that you do is you just transpose the notes. So for example, if you had F, A, C, E, these would have been your treble clef notes, F, A, C, sorry. In treble clef, this would be an F, that would be an A, that would be a C, and that would be an E. But of course, in bass clef, that's not what they are. In bass clef, there's your F, there's your A, there's your C, and there's your E. So everything is shifted down a line. So this is the same principle here. If you had every good boy deserves fudge, you just start here with good boy deserves fudge. Okay, so that's fairly straightforward, in principle at least, but again, it takes a little bit of reading. If you are really comfortable with one clef, you can transpose it like that though, so that does make it a little bit easier. Now, that is actually what I would recommend, because very few instruments actually need to use the tenor and alto clef on anything like a regular basis. So you're much more likely to come across it in a theoretical situation than in an actual practical situation for most people. Because if you play something like the viola or something like that, then you do come across it. So there's the two of them here. The first one is the alto clef. And so the middle C is over here. So the note that would be here in the treble clef is now on the middle line here. So the easiest way to do this is just to say that in the treble clef, that would be a C. And so you shift everything up. So whenever you look at a note, let's say you have this note over here, well, in the treble clef, that would be an A. So in other words, this is your A over there. So it's a little bit mind bending, but with a little bit of practice, you can get used to it. So just to be clear, in the alto clef, this is that is a C, and that is a D up there, and this is an A, and that is a B over there. So, but then of course there's the other one, which is the tenor clef. So we can just draw some lines again, 4, 5. So the tenor clef is exactly the same, except that it sits over there. So this X is just to show. It's not really in the clef, but there's your middle C over there now. So it works exactly the same. There's middle C. That's B. That's A. So you can just work it out. You can do the same thing and work it out from the bass clef, because of course in the bass clef, that's a C, but this note would have been a C in the bass clef. So you can just read it down like that if you're more comfortable reading in the bass clef. So now the question that arises out of this, and just the last little point on note names, is why do we bother with all the different clefs? And specifically, why do we bother with an alto and a tenor clef? Seems a little redundant. The simple reason is that, especially in older notations, there was a tendency to try to avoid using ledger lines. Now, ledger lines is just when you carry on writing. Let's say you're writing a piece of music over here. Let's do it this way. Let's say you're writing a piece of music, and you are in the bass clef over there. So you're writing away, and you want to note that's an octave higher than that. Well, now you're going to go, there's your C, E, G. Well, that's not too bad, but let's say you want to write the next C up from there. So that's a G. Now you want B, C up there. So clearly this becomes fairly difficult to read, and when you have a lot of ledger lines like that, it can become quite cumbersome. So to avoid having to read tons and tons and tons of ledger lines, you can just change the clef. So you can just rewrite that note. That's the C above middle C, which is just there. Much easier. Of course, part of the reason also is in the days when the system was being developed, manuscript paper was quite expensive, so you couldn't really, you didn't want to waste manuscript paper by having to skip over a line of ruled lines, because you had a note that was flying up in space over there. So to conserve paper, you just change the clef. There's probably the more precise reason for why this happened. Because in modern instruments, like for example the flute, if you had that in the treble clef, you do read all the way up to there and higher, even sometimes. So it's not impossible. It's just often it's easier to just change the clef. So that's the basics of note names. Just one more thing. When you are doing the ledger lines, you can see it's just like adding extra lines above the staff lines. And that is basically all you need to know about note names.